They were loaded so close together that one captain described them as being like books on a shelf, chained together such that if a slave died, the corpse could remain in the hold for hours, still chained to other living people. When not in chains, many were beaten and forced to dance on deck for an hour a day to keep them fit. Additional account had it that the captain ordered the slaves killed in 3 batches. Dead by malnutrition or starvation, poor health or inhumane conditions, or sheer wicked cold-blooded murder, their corpses were thrown overboard into the sea for sea animals to feast on. These were the fate of scores of African slaves on the infamous Zong ship from Africa to Jamaica. The slave trade is estimated to have forced 15 million or more people from Africa to provide enslaved labor in the Caribbean and Americas. Over 2 million African people are thought to have died on the journey across the Atlantic. However, the slave trade brought vast wealth to Britain and was allowed to continue for hundreds of years. Among those estimated to have died en route on the Atlantic were the enslaved blacks on the infamous Zong ship. The event, which has come to be known as the Zong black slaves mass killing, did not become famous for the inhumane treatments and killing of the slaves, but for money expected from insurance claims and the resultant legal proceedings. Join us as we have a glimpse into yet another incident in the history of the slave trade era. How inconsequential the lives of enslaved Africans meant next to nothing to Europeans and especially British slavers. Before we go forward, support our work by kindly hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us for more interesting and revealing videos. The slave ship Zong departed the coast of Africa on 6th of September 1781 with 470 slaves. Since this human chattel was such a valuable commodity at that time, many captains took on more slaves than their ships could accommodate in order to maximize profits. The Zong's captain, Luke Collingwood, overloaded his ship with slaves, and by 29 November, many of them had begun to die from disease and malnutrition. The Zong then sailed in an area in the mid-Atlantic known as the doldrums, because of periods of little or no wind. As the ship sat stranded, sickness caused the deaths of 7 of the 17 crew members and over 50 slaves. Increasingly desperate, Collingwood decided to jettison some of the cargo in order to save the ship and provide the ship owners the opportunity to claim for the loss on their insurance. Over the next week, the remaining crew members threw 132 slaves who were sick and dying over the side. Another 10 slaves threw themselves overboard in what Collingwood later described as an act of defiance. Upon the Zong's arrival in Jamaica, James Gregson, the ship's owner, filed an insurance claim for their loss. Gregson argued that the Zong did not have enough water to sustain both crew and the human commodities. The insurance underwriter, Thomas Gilbert, disputed the claim, citing that the Zong had 420 gallons of water aboard when she was inventoried in Jamaica. Despite this, the Jamaican court in 1782 found in favor of the owners. The insurers appealed the case in 1783, and in the process provoked a great deal of public interest and the attention of Great Britain's abolitionists. The leading abolitionist at the time, Granville Sharp, used the deaths of the slaves to increase public awareness about the slave trade and further the anti-slavery cause. It was he who first used the word massacre. Publicity surrounding the first case led William Murray, the Earl of Mansfield, and the Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the highest court in Great Britain, to order a second trial. Mansfield presided and ruled in favor of the insurers. He also held that the cargo had been poorly managed, as the captain should have made a suitable allowance of water for each slave. Sharp attempted to have criminal charges brought against the captain, crew, and the owners, but was unsuccessful. Great Britain's the Solicitor General, Justice John Lee, however, refused to take up the criminal charges, claiming, "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard." Although those who were responsible for the Zong mass killing were never brought to justice, the event was instrumental to successful campaigns to have Parliament abolish slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. The voyage from Africa to the New World of the Americas was called the Middle Passage. Slave ships usually took between 6 and 11 weeks to complete the voyage. Slave ships made large profits by carrying as many slaves as possible across the Atlantic to sell at auction. There were two methods of loading the ship. Tight pack. This method involved packing as many enslaved people into the hold as possible. It was expected that some would die, but a large number would survive the voyage. A ship's hold was cramped, only 5 feet high, with a shelf running round the edge to carry yet more enslaved people. People were loaded in so close together that one captain described them as being like books on a shelf. Loose pack. Fewer enslaved people were loaded, giving them more space to lie out. More enslaved people survived the voyage, so less money was lost. In the case of the Zong ship, the loading was worse than tight. The enslaved cargo was cramped beyond capacity. Enslaved people were chained and movement was restricted. They were unable to go to the toilet and had to lie in their own filth. Sickness quickly spread. Also, they were all chained together. If a slave died, the body could remain in the hold for hours, still chained to other living slaves. The state of the hold would quickly become unbearable, dark, stuffy, and stinking. Aside from the heat and the foul air, there could be so little oxygen that a candle would not burn. Then, there were the challenges with food. African people were often unable to digest the food carried by the European crew, making the sickness worse. Many weakened quickly and died. Enslaved people who became sick were often denied food and left to die, not to mention the high level of mistreatment and humiliation. The crew's treatment of enslaved people was often horrific. Women could be subject to rape. Enslaved people were sometimes forced to dance on deck for an hour a day to keep them fit. Any resistance was dealt with harshly by floggings from the crew. Some enslaved people chose to take their own lives, sometimes by throwing themselves overboard, rather than endure such brutal treatment. Sickness on board a slave ship would often spread to the crew as well, killing many. The death rate among the enslaved people, however, was horrific. It is estimated that 15 to 16% of enslaved people died on the Middle Passage. This has been a regular occurrence but never made headlines until the Zong sale, thanks to the legal fireworks. When Zong sailed from Accra with 442 slaves on 18th of August 1781, it had taken on more than twice the number of people that it could safely transport. In the 1780s, British-built ships typically carried 1.75 slaves per ton of the ship's capacity. On the Zong, the ratio was 4.0 per ton. A British slave ship of the period would carry around 193 slaves, and it was extremely unusual for a ship of Zong's relatively small size to carry so many. After taking on drinking water at Sao Tome, Zong began its voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to Jamaica on 6th of September 1781. On 18 or 19th November, the ship neared Tobago in the Caribbean, but failed to stop there to replenish its water supplies. It is unclear who, if anyone, was in charge of the ship at this point, as Collingwood had been gravely ill for some time. The man who would normally have replaced him, First Mate James Kelsall, had been suspended from duty following an argument on 14th November. Stubbs had captained a slave ship several decades earlier, and he temporarily commanded Zong during Collingwood's incapacitation, but he was not a registered member of the vessel's crew. According to the historian James Walvin, the breakdown of the command structure on the ship might explain the subsequent navigational errors and the absence of checks on supplies of drinking water. On 27 or 28 November, the crew sighted Jamaica at a distance of 27 nautical miles, 50 kilometers, 31 miles, but misidentified it as the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the island of Hispaniola. Zong continued on its westward course, leaving Jamaica behind. This mistake was recognized only after the ship was 300 miles, 480 kilometers, leeward of the island. Overcrowding, malnutrition, accidents, and disease had already killed several mariners and approximately 62 Africans. Kelsall later claimed that there was only 4 days' water remaining on the ship when the navigational error was discovered, and Jamaica was still 10 to 13 sailing days away. If the slaves died on shore, the Liverpool ship owners would have had no redress from their insurers. Similarly, if they died a natural death, as the contemporary term put it, at sea, then insurance could not be claimed. If some enslaved people were thrown overboard to save the rest of the cargo or the ship, then a claim could be made under general average. This principle holds that a captain who jettisons part of his cargo to save the rest can claim for the loss from his insurers. The ship's insurance covered the loss of slaves at £30 per person. Let's leave you to guess which of the three options would top the list of a profiteer, especially in that era. On 29 November, the crew assembled to consider the proposal that some of the slaves should be thrown overboard. Kelsall later claimed that he had disagreed with the plan at first, but it was soon unanimously agreed upon. On 29 November, 54 women and children were thrown through cabin windows into the sea. On 1st of December, 42 male slaves were thrown overboard, and 36 more followed in the next few days. Another 10, in a display of defiance at the inhumanity of the slavers, chose to commit suicide by jumping into the sea. Having heard the shrieks of the victims as they were thrown into the water, one of the captives requested the remaining of them be denied food and drink, rather than being thrown into the sea. The crew ignored this request. In total, 142 Africans were killed by the time the ship reached Jamaica. The account of the King's Bench trial reports that one slave managed to climb back onto the ship after being thrown into the water. The crew claimed that the Africans had been jettisoned because the ship did not have enough water to keep them all alive for the rest of the voyage. This claim was later disputed, as the ship had 420 imperial gallon, that is 1/900 liter, of water left when it finally arrived in Jamaica on 22nd December. An affidavit later made by Kelsall stated that on 1st December, when 42 slaves were killed, it rained heavily for more than a day, allowing 6 casks of water, sufficient for 11 days, to be collected. On 22nd December 1781, Zong arrived at Black River, Jamaica, with 208 slaves on board, less than half the number taken from Africa. The survivors were sold into slavery in January 1782. These people were sold for an average price of £36 per person. The Jamaican Vice Admiralty Court upheld the legality of the British capture of Zong from the Dutch, and the syndicate renamed the ship Richard of Jamaica. Collingwood died 3 days after Zong reached Jamaica, 2 years before the 1783 court proceedings about the case. A quick digression to the background of the ownership of the Zong ship, her crew and circumstances to give you insight and provide clarity on the rest of the event. Zong was originally named Zorg, meaning care in Dutch, by its owners, the Middelburgsche Commercie Compagnie. It operated as a slave ship based in Middelburg, Netherlands, and made a voyage in 1777, delivering enslaved Africans to the Dutch colony of Suriname in South America. Zong was a square-stern ship of 110 tons burden. The British 16-gun brig HMS Alert captured it as part of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War on 10 February 1781. On 26 February, Alert and Zong arrived at Cape Coast Castle in what is now Ghana. Cape Coast Castle was maintained and staffed along with other forts and castles by the Royal African Company, RAC, which used the castle as its regional headquarters. In early March 1781, the master of William purchased Zong on behalf of a syndicate of Liverpool merchants, which included Edward Wilson, George Case, James Aspinall, and William, James, and John Gregson. William Gregson had an interest in 50 slaving voyages between 1747 and 1780. He also served as mayor of Liverpool in 1762. By the end of his life, vessels in which Gregson had a financial stake had carried 58,000 Africans to slavery in the Americas. Zong was paid for with bills of exchange, and the 244 slaves already on board were part of the transaction. The ship was not insured until after it started its voyage. The insurers, another syndicate from Liverpool, underwrote the ship and its slaves for up to £8,000, approximately half the slaves' potential market value. The remaining risk was borne by the owners. Now this is where our digression gets interesting. Zong was the first command of Luke Collingwood, formerly the surgeon on the William. While Collingwood lacked experience in navigation and command, ship's surgeons were typically involved in selecting captured Africans for purchase, so their medical expertise supported the determination of commodity value for a captive. If the surgeon rejected a captive, that individual suffered commercial death, being of no value, and was liable to be killed by the African traders. Sometimes these killings happened in the presence of the surgeon. It is therefore likely that Collingwood had already witnessed the mass killing of slaves. Historian Jeremy Crickler commented that this may have prepared him psychologically to condone the mass killing that later took place on the Zong. Zong's first mate was James Kelsall, who had also served on the William. The vessel's only passenger, Robert Stubbs, was a former captain of slave ships. Stubbs, who had earlier been accused of being a semi-literate drunkard, was aboard to return to Britain. However, Collingwood may have thought his earlier experience on slave ships would be useful. Zong had a 17-man crew when it left Africa, which was far too small to maintain adequate sanitary conditions on the ship. Mariners willing to risk disease and rebellions on slave ships were difficult to recruit within Britain and were harder to find for a vessel captured from the Dutch off the coast of Africa. Zong was manned with remnants of the previous Dutch crew, the crew of William, and with unemployed sailors hired from settlements along the African coast. After the slaver ship reached port at Black River, Jamaica, Zong's owners made a claim to their insurers for the loss of the enslaved Africans. When the insurers refused to pay, the resulting court cases, Gregson versus Gilbert, 1783, 3 Doug KB 232, held that in some circumstances the murder of enslaved Africans was legal and that insurers could be required to pay for those who had died. The jury found for the slavers, but at a subsequent appeal, hearing the judges, led by Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, ruled against the slave trading syndicate owners on the grounds that new evidence suggested that the captain and crew were at fault. Following the first trial, Olaudah Equiano, a freedman, brought news of the mass killing to the attention of the anti-slavery campaigner Granville Sharp, who worked unsuccessfully to have the ship's crew prosecuted for murder. Because of the legal dispute, reports of the mass killing received increased publicity, stimulating the abolitionist movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Zong events were increasingly cited as a powerful symbol of the horrors of the Middle Passage, the transoceanic route by which enslaved Africans were brought to the New World. When news of the Zong massacre reached Great Britain, the ship's owners claimed compensation from their insurers for the loss of the slaves. The insurers refused to honor the claim, and the owners took them to court. Zong's logbook went missing after the ship reached Jamaica, 2 years before the hearing started. As such, the legal proceedings provide almost all the documentary evidence about the mass unaliving, though there is no formal record of the first trial other than what is referred to in the subsequent appeals hearing. The ship's insurers claimed that the log had been deliberately destroyed, which the Gregson syndicate denied. Almost all the surviving source material is of questionable reliability. The two witnesses who gave evidence, Stubbs and Kelsall, were strongly motivated to exonerate themselves from blame. It is possible that the figures concerning the number of people killed, the amount of water that remained on the ship, and the distance beyond Jamaica that Zong had mistakenly sailed are inaccurate. It's worthy of mention that at this period in time, only full-status British citizens can stand to give evidence. The first legal proceedings began when the insurers refused to compensate the owners of Zong. The dispute was initially tried at the Guildhall in London on 6 March 1783, with the Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, overseeing the trial before a jury. Mansfield was previously the judge in Somerset's case in 1772, which concerned the legality of enslaving people in Britain. He had ruled on that previous case that slavery had never been established by statute in Britain and was not supported by common law. Stubbs was the only witness in the first Zong trial, and the jury found in favor of the owners, under an established protocol in maritime insurance that considered slaves as cargo. On 19th March 1783, Olaudah Equiano, a former slave, told the anti-slave trade activist Granville Sharp of the events aboard Zong, and a newspaper soon carried a lengthy account, reporting that the captain had ordered the slaves killed in 3 batches. Sharp sought the possibility of prosecuting the crew for murder. The insurers applied to the Earl of Mansfield to have the previous verdict set aside and for the case to be tried again. A hearing was held at the Court of King's Bench in Westminster Hall on 21st to 22nd May 1783, before Mansfield and 2 other King's Bench judges, Mr. Justice Buller and Mr. Justice Wills. The Solicitor General John Lee appeared on behalf of the Zong's owners, as he had done previously in the Guildhall trial. Sharp was also in attendance, together with the secretary he had hired to take a written record of the proceedings. Summing up the verdict reached in the first trial, Mansfield said that the jury had no doubt that the case of slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. Isn't this very much unbelievable? He went further that the question was whether there was not an absolute necessity for throwing them overboard to save the rest. The jury were of opinion there was. Collingwood had died in 1781, and the only witness of the mass killing to appear at Westminster Hall was again Stubbs, although a written affidavit by First Mate Kelsall was made available to the lawyers. Stubbs claimed that there was an absolute necessity for throwing over the Negroes, because the crew feared all the slaves would die if they did not throw some into the sea. The insurers argued that Collingwood had made a blunder and mistake in sailing beyond Jamaica, and that slaves had been killed so their owners could claim compensation. They alleged that Collingwood did this because he did not want his first voyage as a slave ship captain to be unprofitable. Lee responded by saying that the slaves perished just as a cargo of goods perished and were jettisoned for the greater good of the ship. The insurers' lawyers replied that Lee's argument could never justify the killing of innocent people. Each of the three addressed issues of humanity in the treatment of the slaves and said that the actions of Zong's crew were nothing less than murder. At the hearing, new evidence was heard that heavy rain had fallen on the ship on the second day of the killings, but still a third batch of slaves was killed. This led Mansfield to order another trial, because the rainfall meant that the killing of those people, after the water shortage had been eased, could not be justified in terms of the greater necessity of saving the ship and the rest of the slaves aboard. One of the judges also said that this evidence invalidated the findings of the jury in the first trial, as the jury had heard testimony that the water shortage resulted from the poor condition of the ship, brought on by unforeseen maritime conditions, rather than from errors committed by its captain. Mansfield concluded that the insurers were not liable for losses resulting from errors committed by Zong's crew. There is no evidence that another trial was held on this issue. Despite Sharp's efforts, no member of the crew was prosecuted for murder. Even so, the Zong case did eventually gain both national and international attention. Jeremy Crickler has argued that Mansfield wanted to ensure that commercial law remained as helpful to Britain's overseas trade as possible, and as a consequence was keen to uphold the principle of general average, even in relation to the killing of humans. For Mansfield to have found in favor of the insurers would have greatly undermined this idea. The revelation that rain had fallen during the period of the killings enabled Mansfield to order a retrial while leaving the notion of general average intact. He emphasized that the mass killing would have been legally justified and the owner's insurance claim would have been valid if the water shortage had not arisen from mistakes made by the captain. Crickler comments that Mansfield's conclusions ignored the ruling precedent of his predecessor, Sir Matthew Hale, that the killing of innocents in the name of self-preservation was unlawful. This ruling was to prove important a century later in R.V. Dudley and Stevens, which also concerned the justifiability of acts of murder at sea. Mansfield also failed to acknowledge another important legal principle, that no insurance claim can be legal if it arose from an illegal act. It was as a result of these mass deaths and nonchalance by the slavers, knowing that their losses would be covered by insurance, that led to the legislation of the Slave Trade Act, 1788, Dolben's Act. In 1788, British MP William Dolben put forward a bill to regulate conditions on board slave ships. He described horrors of enslaved people chained hand and foot, stowed like herrings in a barrel, and stricken with putrid and fatal disorders. The Slave Trade Act, 1788, was passed and controlled the number of captives a ship was permitted to carry, according to its weight. Dolben's Act also ordered all slave ships to carry a doctor who had to keep records about the enslaved Africans on board. These doctors received bonuses according to the number of Africans who survived the journey. Conditions, however, remained appalling. The Non-Denominational Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787. The next year, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, 1788, its first law regulating the slave trade to limit the number of slaves per ship. Then, in 1791, Parliament prohibited insurance companies from reimbursing ship owners when enslaved Africans were murdered by being thrown overboard. Granville Sharp campaigned to raise awareness of the mass killing, writing letters to newspapers, the Lords Commissioners of Admiralty, and the Prime Minister, the Duke of Portland. Neither Portland nor the Admiralty sent him a reply. Only one London newspaper reported the first Zong trial in March 1783. but it provided details of events. The newspaper article in March 1783 was the first public report of the mass killing, and it was published nearly 18 months after the event. Little else about the event appeared in print before 1787. Despite these setbacks, Sharp's efforts did have some success. In April 1783, he sent an account of the Zong slave ship event to William Dillwyn, a Quaker, who had asked to see evidence that was critical of the slave trade. The London yearly meeting of the Society of Friends decided shortly after to begin campaigning against slavery, and a petition signed by 273 Quakers was submitted to Parliament in July 1783. Sharp also sent letters to Anglican bishops and clergy, and to those already sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. The immediate effect of the Zong mass killings on public opinion was limited, demonstrating, as the historian of abolitionism Seymour Drescher has noted, the challenge that the early abolitionists faced. Following Sharp's efforts, the Zong mass killings became an important topic in abolitionist literature, and the Cold Murders was discussed in works by Thomas Clarkson, Ottobah Cugoano, James Ramsey, and John Newton. These accounts often omitted the names of the ship and its captain, thereby creating, in the words of Srividya Swaminathan, a portrait of abuse that could be mapped onto any ship in the Middle Passage. The Zong killings offered a powerful example of the horrors of the slave trade, stimulating the development of the abolitionist movement in Britain, which dramatically expanded in size and influence in the late 1780s. In 1787, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded. Parliament received numerous petitions against the slave trade and examined the issue in 1788. With strong support by Sir William Dolben, who had toured a slave ship, it passed the Slave Trade Act 1788, Dolben's Act, which was its first legislation to regulate the slave trade. It restricted the number of slaves that could be transported to reduce problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation. Its renewal in 1794 included an amendment that limited the scope of insurance policies concerning slaves, rendering illegal such generalized phrases that promised to insure against all other perils, losses, and misfortunes. The Zong owners' representatives had highlighted such a phrase in seeking their claim at the King's Bench hearing. The act had to be renewed annually, and Dolben led these efforts, speaking frequently to Parliament in opposition to slavery. The Slave Trade Act 1799 was passed to make these provisions permanent. Abolitionists, notably William Wilberforce, continued their effort to end the slave trade. Britain passed the Slave Trade Act 1807, which prohibited the Atlantic slave trade, and the Royal Navy enforced the blockade of Africa. The United States also prohibited the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 and helped intercept illegal slave ships at sea, predominantly after 1842. In 1823, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, throughout the British dominions, known as the First Anti-Slavery Society, was founded in Britain, dedicated to abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 represented the achievement of their goal. The Zong mass killings was frequently cited in abolitionist literature, with its many allusions to the slave trade in Antigua. The 1839 edition of Clarkson's book had an important influence on the artist J.M.W. Turner, who displayed a painting at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1840 entitled The Slave Ship. The painting depicts a vessel from which a number of manacled slaves have been thrown into the sea to be devoured by sharks. Some of the details in the painting, such as the shackles worn by the slaves, appear to have been influenced by the illustrations in Clarkson's book. The painting was shown at an important time in the movement to abolish slavery in the world, as the Royal Academy exhibition opened 1 month before the First World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. The mass killing has inspired works of art and literature. It was remembered in London in 2007, among events to mark the bicentenary of the British Slave Trade Act 1807, which abolished British participation in the African slave trade, though stopped short of outlawing slavery. A monument to the murdered enslaved Africans on Zong was later installed at Black River, Jamaica.